and I call the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I rise today to speak in support of that amendment and as part of the debate on this bill, which Labor supports these changes to paid parental leave, which will make it more flexible for many families to use the scheme as it suits them. And this is a good thing. But I wanted to begin by just reflecting on the introduction of Australia's first paid parental leave scheme, which was under the Labor government, the Julia Gillard government, and then Social Services Minister Jenny Macklin. And that it is one of our Labor's great legacies that we have delivered for this country, and something that we're very proud of. So at the time when paid parental leave was first introduced in 2011, we were one of only 2 OECD countries, the other being the United States, that did not have a state-provided paid parental leave scheme. So it was about time that we got one, and a very good thing. When the scheme was first introduced, the purposes of the scheme, there are 4 very distinct objectives of the scheme. And these were looked at the time by the Productivity Commission, and the scheme that was introduced was very similar to what was recommended by that process. So these 4 objectives were to allow primary carers to take time off work to care for their child after the child's birth or adoption, to enhance the health and development of birth mothers and children, to enable women to continue to participate in the workforce, and to promote equality between men and women and the balance between work and family life. And each of these objectives is very important in its own right, and the scheme serves those objectives. And I'd just like to talk a bit more about that. Since it was introduced in 2011, over 1.2 million families have used the scheme. That's almost 150,000 parents each year that benefit from that paid parental leave scheme. Importantly, at the time when it was introduced as well, many women in Australia had no access to employer-funded leave either. And this is something that continues. Still, many women in particular industries, particularly lower paid work, have no access to anything from their employers. Women in particularly casual work, seasonal work, and as I said, low-paid jobs are particularly disadvantaged in that area, with no access to any paid leave when they had a child. And therefore this obviously disadvantages them in 2 key ways: when they have their child, that they have no financial support in a time when they need to take some time to recover from having the baby and to raise that baby and bond with the baby. But also that in many cases they then find it very hard to return to the workforce, because they actually have to just leave those jobs. And so this was one of the key objectives of introducing the scheme, was to support those women who had access to no support at that time. And an evaluation that was conducted at the time showed that it actually sparked that conversation with employers, and actually many employers for the first time introduced their own scheme in response to the government scheme being introduced, either to augment the 18 weeks provided by the government, or just generally their first schemes were introduced. And this has continued on since then, which is a great development. So the gender pay gap remains a problem in Australia, despite the Treasurer's recent contention in Question Time in September that it had closed. It in fact does continue on, with female workers in Australia still earning 14% less than their male colleagues. It is a fact that the gender pay gap in Australia has remained stubbornly high over the past 2 decades, with any minor changes being widely attributed to the ending of the mining boom. If the Treasurer and the Prime Minister were genuinely serious about fixing the gender pay gap, they would oppose cuts to penalty rates. The vast majority of the workers who've had their penalty rates cut are women, and the cuts to penalty rates are exacerbating the gender pay gap, not just making it harder for women to pay the rent and cover the bills. But paid parental leave is also an important part of this. There are many reasons why in Australia we have a gender wage gap, and why women face disadvantage in the workplace more generally. And there are, as I said, there are many reasons, and those are all things that we should look at. But I do believe that one of the key reasons that inequality continues in our workplace is that it is still primarily seen as a woman's role to take time off to care for children. And I feel that we will not really address this gap until it's seen as normal for both men and women with children to take time out of the workforce, be it the leave they take after the birth or adoption of a child, or sort of the part-time work that can continue in years after that. And I really think that paid parental leave begins that process early by dads, so Labor's scheme also, of course, provides dad and partner pay, which is 2 weeks of leave for dads to take after the birth of the child. And of course, paid parental leave can be exchanged between both parents, so the father can take some time in primary caring. And I think the sharing of this role is not just beneficial for equality in the workplace, but it also men for generations have generally missed out on that wonderful time with children in those young years because they've been primarily at work and women primarily in the home. And I think both men and women have a lot to gain by the better sharing of that role. And as we're seeing that happening more and more, I know that many fathers that I know who've either gone part-time or taken time off full-time with their children say it is the best things that have ever done for their relationship with their children and their partners. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's something that I think, as a nation, we could be doing a lot more with paid parental leave to enable that sharing of the roles. One particular issue that has been raised with me by some of my constituents is the fact that there is a means test on the mother of $150,000 a year, so it is quite high, but that in the case where the mother exceeds that but the father does not, that they can't actually transfer that leave over to the father because they themselves are not eligible. And while there are obviously very good reasons for that means test, I think it is something that could be looked at in terms of enabling that, again, that fairer sharing between both the genders and not assuming, of course, that the male partner is always the higher earner. So, just coming back, so paid parental leave, it really signals to employers and the Australian community that parents taking time out of the paid workforce to care for a child is part of the normal course of life. And I think this is one of the most important objectives of the scheme. It, of course, also enables women to continue participating in the workforce. As I said, many women were just faced with a choice to leave their jobs, and this enables them to keep in contact with their employer, which is another important aspect of the scheme. And it also goes some way to addressing that gender pay gap towards retirement age, where we see around a third of women facing poverty there, and that is, again, perhaps the major cause of that is the time taken out for raising children over the course of women's careers. So this bill will enable mothers and families to split their paid parental leave entitlements into blocks of time over a 2-year period with a period of work between. Currently, the scheme only allows public paid parental leave to be taken as a continuous 18-week block within the first 12 months after the birth or adoption of a child, and then only when the primary carer has not returned to work since the birth or adoption of the child. So this bill will change the rules by splitting the 18 weeks of paid parental leave into a 12-week paid parental leave period and a 6-week flexible paid parental leave period. And the 12-week paid parental leave entitlement will only be available as a continuous block, but will be accessible by the primary carer at any time during the first 12 months, not only immediately after the birth or adoption. The 6-week flexible paid parental leave period will be taken at any time during the first 2 years and does not need to be taken as a block. So in practice, this will mean that families can split their entitlements over a 2-year period with periods of work in between. And as with the current rules, the primary carer can be changed during this time. It is likely that the most common use of the increased flexibility will be parents returning to work part-time and spreading their flexible paid parental leave period out over several months. So this is a really positive change. However, as I said, we could be doing so much more with paid parental leave in this country. If we look to some of the other countries around the world that provide much longer leave, better paid leave, and importantly that sharing between fathers and mothers, that there's more leave provided for fathers, or a sort of use it or lose it policy where there's an amount of leave that must be taken by the father. Another important issue with paid parental leave is the current scheme does provide 18 weeks, which was based on the Productivity Commission's recommendation that for the health of the mother and the child, it's ideal that the mother takes 26 weeks from work. But it was based on budgetary constraints at the time, and the idea that many women had other leave they could access, that it would be 18 weeks. But looking to increase that at some point would be another great thing that we could do for families in this nation, to enable women to have a full 6 months of paid leave home with their children, and fathers, as I said, that is a great thing. Another issue, of course, is that superannuation. There is a gap in superannuation for women when they come to retire because of the time that they take out to raise children, and attaching that to paid parental leave is another thing that one day could be considered. But again, I just want to reflect again on the fact that without Labor having introduced this, we still would not have a paid parental leave scheme in this country. And we have one that many families, almost half of new mothers, are benefiting from, and that continues to grow. And it's wonderful to see dads increasingly taking more time off when their children are born, and also going part-time. I know in my own family, this is something that my husband and I had always planned to do when we had a child, that we would both share the time looking after them, and it has been a really wonderful thing, a real richness for men in their lives to have that one-on-one time with their child that perhaps in generations past they didn't have. So, as I said, we support these changes, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.